Hello and welcome back. You remember that we talked once about how letters behave. A verb whose three-letter root only contains letters that behave nicely, like pekuf dalet, is called a strong verb. But many roots, including many of the most common Hebrew verbs, contain one of those letters that, quote unquote, misbehave. Today we're starting a series of 5 lessons looking specifically at categories of roots with those misbehaving letters. We've seen many of these verbs in our various examples, the Vayomer Elohim way, but now we're going to work through them a bit more systematically. I'm going to point to the differences and explain why they're different, but it's a lot to absorb. The explanations are not the important part. The important part is being able to recognize the forms. All this information is in your course guidebook as well. The verbs we're going to look at in these lessons will be kal verbs. When we officially learn the other binyanim, piel, hifil, hitpael, one of the things we'll be doing is looking at how these categories apply in those binyanim. Right now, just kal. I told you that kal verbs are the most various looking because the other binyanim themselves have a particular shape that limits the variations you can have. Kal is much more loosey-goosey, which is why so many of the verbs we've seen look so different, even though they are all kal verbs. How the different categories of verbs work depends not only on how the letters behave, but on where in the root each letter falls, as the first, second, or third radical. Radical again means root letter. And there are 2 different ways of naming these categories. One is simply by counting. So a root whose first consonant is a nun may be called first nun or labeled with a Roman numeral. 1 nun. In writing, the Hebrew letter may be printed or transliterated. A root whose second consonant is a guttural would be called second guttural or 2 guttural, or sometimes middle guttural. A root whose third consonant is an aleph would be called third aleph or 3 aleph. But the traditional way to name them is by using the same root that's used to name the binyanim, Pei, Ayin, Lamed. In this system, which is still used for modern Hebrew, and it's not uncommon for biblical Hebrew, Pei indicates the first root letter, Ayin the second root letter, and Lamed the third root letter. A first nun root would be called Pei nun, with a double hash mark in between the 2 letters. That's how Hebrew indicates an abbreviation. A third aleph root would be called Lamed aleph. That's the system that comes most naturally to me. So even though I'll sometimes use the numbers for the sake of clarity, sometimes you'll hear me say Pei, Ayin, or Lamed instead. If you can remember Ma Pa'al El, what hath God wrought from Numbers 23:23, then you can remember Pei, Ayin, Lamed in the correct 1, 2, 3 order. In this lesson, we're going to look at roots that have guttural letters in them, in all 3 places in the root. And for our purposes, the guttural letters are He, Chet, and Ayin. The letter Aleph is also a guttural, but as you may remember, it likes to keep itself a bit apart from the others. It really falls into a special category, so we'll talk about it another time. Now, the 3 rules about how guttural letters behave were the letters Aleph, Chet, He, Ayin, and Resh will not take a dagesh. The letters Aleph, He, Chet, and Ayin resist simple shva underneath them and expect a compound shva. And the letters He, Chet, and Ayin attract the vowel patach and must be preceded by an a vowel when they end a word. As you can see, He, Chet, and Ayin are the three musketeers of the gutturals. They act alike. None of the kal forms demand a dagesh, so that rule will not affect us right now. But kal forms certainly do have shvas, and plenty of roots, and therefore verb forms, will end with chet or ayin. Warning, roots that end with he are very common, but they form a separate, extremely important category called lamed he. That he is not a guttural, it's a vowel letter telling you to pronounce a vowel at the end of the word. As we discussed, that he replaces an original yud. At the end of a word, a he is only a guttural if there's a mapik in the he, like this. That's the kind we're talking about in this lesson. There's only one root I can think of off the top of my head that has a guttural he in the third position, and that's gimel bet he, to be tall. But when he is the first or second radical, it is definitely a consonant and therefore a guttural. All right, let's get started. And we're going to start with the perfect. Reminder, perfect by itself is a past tense, but a v or an u converts it to imperfect meaning. Amar, he said, ve amar, and he will say. Let's look again at the strong verb first. Shamar, which means keep or guard. To review the forms, that's the verb we originally learned with, so we'll notice where the gutturals differ. Once again, the brackets indicate that this exact word does not actually occur in the Bible. The perfect form always has an ending marking the PGN, the person, gender, and number of the verb, except in the third masculine singular. That form doesn't have an ending, so when the third root letter is a guttural, it's the last letter of the word, and therefore has to have a patach before it. But if you look at that form, shamar, in our chart, you'll see that the vowel before the third radical is a patach all the time. So that rule will not cause us any problems in the kal perfect. But, as you can see, the other rule, the shva rule, is definitely going to come into play. Now, the shva that you see under the resh in some of these forms, that's a silent shva. It's not a schwa sound. It's just marking the end of a syllable. In this writing system, every consonant has to have a vowel marker except the very last one in the word. So that shva won't be a problem because it's not really a sound. The gutturals don't care about it. But the other places you see a shva in this paradigm, this verb chart, is where a vowel is being shortened, contracted. There are 4 places where this happens. In the third feminine singular, shamra, and the third common plural, shamaru, and in the second person plurals, shimartem and shimarten. Those shvas, which do indicate a tiny little vowel sound, if they are under a guttural letter, they have to be a compound shva. In the second person ones, the shva is under the shin, the first radical. In the third person ones, the shva is under the second radical, the mem. So first gutturals will have 2 forms that are not like the strong verb, and second gutturals will have 2 different forms that are not like the strong verb. Let's do some comparison. The root ayin, zayin, bet means to leave or to abandon. Shamarnu, we kept. Azavnu, we left. Shamaru, they kept. Azvu, they left. Just replace the 3 consonants of shamar with the 3 of azav, and it works fine. But when you do that with shimartem, you kept, With a shva under that first consonant, because of the guttural letter, you have to have a compound shva, a patach shva. So it's shmartem, but azavtem. Looks like an a vowel, but it's a variety of shva. So azavtem is exactly the same form as shmartem. Exactly. Kal, perfect, second masculine plural. Now let's look at the other two forms that are different in the perfect when there's a guttural, but these, remember, are only affected when the guttural letter is the second radical. Tzahak, tzadi chet kuf, means to laugh. It's the root that gave Isaac Yitzchak his name, as we'll see shortly. Shamar, he kept. Tzahak, he laughed. Doesn't appear in the Bible, just so you don't think it's only feminine forms that sometimes don't occur. Again, all you do is replace the consonants, and that's what you do in all the forms that I'm not bothering to show you. But in the third feminine singular and the third common plural, when that second vowel is contracted to a shva, it's shamra and shamaru, but tzahaka and tzahaku. Same as before, the Kal perfect in those forms calls for a shva, and the guttural letter insists that it be a compound shva. The verb form gets what it wants, the guttural letter gets what it wants. We just have to realize what's going on so that we can recognize the form of the verb. Like all the differences we're going to see in this section of the course, these forms are obvious. If you agree, great. If you didn't quite get it yet, don't worry. You are guaranteed to get it eventually because it really is obvious. These are not irregular verbs, any of them. I could make up a brand new root that never existed in Hebrew, and if I put a hey or a chet or an ayin in it, the form it would take is totally predictable. Nothing wrong if it takes you some time, but this is a completely achievable goal. And remember, our purpose in learning these forms is to be able to recognize who's doing what and when. To not be confused if the verb form is a little different than we expected, because we can see why it's different and ignore the difference. Now let's move on to the participle form. The participle, you remember, is the verbal adjective, the form that describes someone doing an action, a talking dog, or the dog is talking. As an adjective, it doesn't have person, only gender and number, so there are just 4 forms to worry about. There's always an O after the first radical, so a pay guttural, a first guttural, won't be any different than a strong verb in this form. But 3 of these forms have a shva under the second radical, so ayin gutturals will demand a compound shva. And if the last radical is a guttural, it will demand a patach. Let's look at those forms. You remember Moses in Exodus 3:3 asking, Madua lo yiv'ar hasneh? Why doesn't the bush burn up? He asked this question because in the previous verse, Hine hasneh bo'er ba'esh. Behold, hasneh, the bush, was burning with fire. Beit ayin resh. Second radical is a guttural, an ayin, and the masculine singular form is the same as always. There's no shva in that form. But the other 3 forms, bo'ara, bo'arim, bo'arot, all have a compound shva instead of a simple shva. Bo'eret, which also occurs, doesn't have a shva, so it's no different than omeret. With the lamed guttural forms, our rule about gutturals and patachs comes into play. I picked 2 different verbs for these examples, so you're only seeing words that actually occur in the Bible. lakach for the masculine forms, it means take, and parach for the feminine forms, it means blossom. In the plural forms, our guttural letter is the beginning of a syllable, so it's no different than a strong verb. But look what happens in the singular. And look carefully, please, because what you're about to see is incredibly common in the language. You want to get very comfortable with it. First, the masculine singular form, omer, boer, kotev, writing, but lokeach. I'll remind you that often that patach looks like it's under the hey, chet, or ayin. Be careful. It's really meant to be read in between the tsere, the a vowel, and the guttural letter. It's called a furtive patach. There's got to be a patach before a final hey, chet, or ayin. Sometimes they change the previous vowel, and sometimes they just sneak a patach in there furtively. Next, that feminine singular form. Instead of omeret, boeret, kotevet, we have porachat. We've seen that seglet shape do this in nouns, remember. It's melech and eretz, but nachal, a wadi, and baal. There are all kinds of grammatical forms where you have a seglet shape ending with a taf, and if the letter in between those two sigols is a guttural, it will transform them into patachs. Again, the sooner you get comfortable with these forms, the sooner you can forget about them. They are completely predictable, they're extremely common, and they're part of the natural flow of the Hebrew language. The more you read, the more you listen, the more natural they will become to you. Your goal is to forget that there's any difference at all between the forms of the participles notain, giving, and lokeach, taking. Not notain and lokech, but notain and lokeach. But you know why that extra sound is there, so you can forget about it. They're both masculine singular kal participles, despite their slightly different shape. And let's not forget kal passive participles, the only binyan that has two participles. I, you, they, she, we are writing, kotev, kotevet, kotvim, kotvot, but it was being written katuv, kituva, kituvim, kituvot. Shva under the first radical in three of the forms. Third radical at the end in the other form. I'm just going to show them to you in the chart. Azav, to abandon. Patach, to open. In the three forms with endings, it's ktuva or ptucha, but azuva with a compound shva. Same thing in the two plural forms. In the masculine singular, it's katuv or azuv, abandoned, but patuach, opened. And you know why. Because by now, you know how guttural consonants behave. Now we're going to look at how they behave in the imperfect form. Once more, a review of the full paradigm for strong verbs so that we can get a preview of what will be happening with gutturals. Eshmor, I. Tishmor, you, guy. Tishmari, you, gal. Yishmor, he. Tishmor, again, she. Nishmor, we. Tishmeru, y'all guys. Tishmorna, y'all gals. Yishmeru, they guys. Tishmorna, they gals. And Yishmeru if it's a mixed group, of course. What have we got? Shva under the first radical in all the forms. Shva under the second radical in three of the forms. And the third radical is at the end in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the forms. Let's start with that one. When the third radical is a guttural letter, the O vowel is replaced by a patach. He will keep yishmor, but he will send yishlach. We've actually seen this pattern many times already. And here's another one. It will be tol, yigbah. Notice that mapik in the hey. This is a real hey, a consonant, a guttural hey. That's what a dot in the hey at the end of a word is for, to show you that it's a real consonant, not a vowel letter. And it turns out that the influence of gutturals means that when the second radical is a guttural, it's still going to affect that last vowel. You remember tzahak, laugh, and what happened when 90-year-old Sarah was told she was going to have a baby? Vatitzchak Sarah, not titzchok, titzchak because of the chet. God demanded to know, Lama zet tzachaka Sarah? Why is it Sarah laughed? Perfect verb with a compound shva, where otherwise a simple shva would be. And eventually, Sarah said that everyone would laugh. Yitzchak, third masculine singular imperfect. But also the name they were told to give this son, Isaac. In Hebrew, Yitzchak, he will laugh. Now the second radical, also doing what we've seen it do in the other forms, like tzachaka. Example, they will keep, yishmeru. They will wash, yirchatzu. Compound shva replaces simple shva. Look at the paradigm of shamar to see where that's going to happen. Second and third masculine plural, tishmeru and yishmeru. And second feminine singular, tishmeri. The three forms where there's a shva under the second radical. But now that first radical. Let's start with yishmor and work our way through the difference. If the first radical is a guttural, there's a shva underneath it. That shva looks like it's just marking the end of a syllable, yish, more, but really it isn't. The unmarked form without any prefix is not part of the imperfect, but it does exist. It does other jobs in the language. In a strong verb, the unmarked form is shmor. And now you can see that for a guttural letter, that shva has to be changed to a compound shva. Let's try it, using the root ayin mem daled to stand. First, we'll replace shamar with amad to stand. Asterisk, because this form not only never occurs, it never could occur. Next, we replace that simple shva with a compound shva. But now, we've got a vowel before that compound shva. And when that happens, the vowel always matches the compound shva. Whatever is the partial vowel in the compound shva, a, e, o, patach, segol, kamatz, whatever it is, the full vowel that comes immediately before it is always going to assimilate to it. Your mouth has to get ready to say that upcoming vowel, and it's easier when the previous vowel matches. When there's a compound shva, it always does. So, ya'amod, he will stand. Ta'amod, she will stand, or you, masculine singular. Na'amod, we will stand, and so forth. Only in the first person singular would it be e'emod, if that word occurred in the Bible, which it doesn't. E'emod, because the desire of the aleph prefix for an e vowel in this form is stronger than the ayin's desire for an a vowel. And here is a list of some of the most common verbs with hey, chet, and ayin in their roots. We'll look at roots with aleph separately, And I've left out the lamed hey roots that also have gutturals. We'll see them next time. It's actually quite common for roots to fall into more than one of the categories we'll be looking at. Bachar, to choose. Batach, to trust. Ga'al, redeem. Harag, kill. Chata, sin. Chashav, plan. Yada, know. Lakach, take. Naga, touch. Nasa, travel. Avad, work. Avar, cross. Azav, abandon. Amad, to stand. Patach, to open. Shachach, forget. Shalach, send. Shama, hear. And let's look at some examples in the actual Bible. Here's one we've already seen, Genesis 2:24, where I asked you to take the verb on faith. Now you can do it yourselves. The man has just figured out that the woman is the proper mate for him. And the narrator explains, Al kain ya'azov ish et aviv ve'et imo ve'davak be'ishto. Ya'azov doesn't look anything like yishmor, but it's the same verb form. Kal, third masculine singular imperfect. And now you understand why. The O sound is spelled with a kamatz because it's in a closed, unaccented syllable. And the beginning of the verb is different because the ayin demands a compound shva, and the vowel under the prefix has to match it. Therefore, a man leaves, imperfect verb because this is what generally happens, et aviv ve'et imo, his father and mother, ve'davak be'ishto, and he sticks to his wife. As soon as I say and, it's going to flip the tense of the verb. So an imperfect verb, ya'azov, is matched by a converted perfect verb, ve'davak. And another one we've seen from Genesis 4:10, Dimei achicha tzoakim elai min ha'adama. Your brother's blood, using the plural form of the word, dimei, your brother's blood, tzoakim, crying out. Compound shva under the ayin, kal masculine plural participle. Your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. Here's one from the story of Joseph, Genesis 37:26. Vayomer Yehuda el Echav. Judah said to his brothers, Ma betza, what profit, what benefit is it? Ki naharog et achinu, if we kill our brother. Naharog, same thing as ya'azov a minute ago. Naharog, we will kill. It might be worth looking at 3 of the 10 commandments. No sermonizing. I'm just going to show you 3 kal imperfect verbs from Exodus 20:13. Or 13, 14, and 15. There are different ways to count the verses in this chapter. Exactly the same grammatical form, all 3 of them, kal imperfect second masculine singular, even though the words may look and sound different to you. Here they are. Lo tirtzach, lo tin'af, lo tignov. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal. All of them are second masculine singular, imperfect, kal verbs. Tignov, a strong verb, so it has precisely the same pattern as tishmor. Tin'af, because in the middle of the root, a guttural aleph will also call for an a vowel, just like hechet and ayin. And tirtzach, because the third root letter is a chet, and you have to have an a vowel before it. Normally a patach, but This is a self-contained commandment, just 2 words and 6 letters, but we're pausing here. So our A vowel can be a little bit longer than just a patach. That's why it's a kamatz here, and in lo tinaf. Once more, lo tirtzach, lo tinaf, lo tignov. Different roots, but all 3 exactly the same verb form. It's only the gutturals in the first 2 roots that make the verb look different. You want to learn to look through those differences to see the essential similarity. Let's finish by looking at a couple more verses from the story of Abraham and Sarah, or Abram and Sarai as they originally were. Sarai decides that she is barren and tells Abram to sleep with her servant Hagar so she can have a child vicariously. What happens? Vayishma Avram lekol Sarai. Abram listened, patach, because that verb ends with an ayin, le, to, kol Sarai, a construct phrase, the voice of Sarai. But when you listen le or be, the voice of someone, that means to obey them. Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. He heeded her. Eventually, as you know, they implemented Plan B, and Abraham was told in Genesis 18:10, Hine ven le Sarah ishtecha. Behold, a son for your wife Sarah, or perhaps to your wife. She's going to have a son. Now, this announcement was given outdoors to Abraham, but Sarah was in the entrance of the tent, petach ha'ohel, the opening of the tent, a noun from petach, to open. Vesarah shoma'at, and Sarah was listening. Not shome'et, like kotevet or shomeret, but shoma'at, because of that guttural ayin. Kal, feminine singular participle. And remember that the participle does not tell you when it happened, so we have to get the tense from the context. Not she's listening now or will be listening, but was listening when that announcement was made. All right, your challenge in Numbers 22, of course, is to find at least 5 verbs where guttural letters change the standard form. See you next time.